All right. Hello, guys, and welcome to Unit 2 of our American History 1301 class. I have Lightning here, my husband's cat, and my adopted daughter, because she insisted she wanted to be here for this very important lecture. She loves talking about history so much. So there she is. Unit 2 is going to be where we talk about the Great Awakening, the Enlightenment, the social and political philosophies that were going around the 1700s. I know. But then we're going to get into the French and Indian War. I know some of you really like, getting into some action. And if you like that, this is the unit for you. Because after that, then we ramp right into the American Revolution, which will be the last part of Unit 2. So that's really what we're going to be talking about. And there you have that famous illustration there done actually during the French and Indian War, not during the American Revolution, by Benjamin Franklin, a very important, very famous American founding father, but never a president of the United States, like many people wrongly assume. So here we go. All right, so we're going to start talking about what, in general, people, educated people at the time, were reading and what they were thinking, because these ideas will directly translate into the American Revolution for independence. And the most important movement that was going on in the late 17th and early to middle 18th century, the 1700s, was the Enlightenment. Now this goes back to like the Renaissance. You guys have probably learned about in like world history, this rebirth of culture, bringing back, the ancient Greek and Roman ideas, the classics, they're called Greek and Roman. But this is about applying reason, logic, scientific method to society, to politics, to how we govern and how we look out for each other. That's a basic definition of the Enlightenment. And it also translates to religion at this time as well, because if you think about it, since the fall of the Roman Empire, the most important structure in people's lives was their faith, and all organized by the church. So the church was the ultimate authority. And that's where, through like divine right to rule, kings and queens were given their power over the people, supposedly. It was kind of like an inherent unspoken truth. They were God's emissary on earth, kind of like the Pope. You're having a good time. She's super excited about this lecture. She loves the Enlightenment. You can leave anytime, you don't have to be in my lap. Okay, sorry guys. And I'm sorry, I know y'all aren't supposed to be doing this, distractions. This is why they're distracting, right? She's just staring at me, isn't she? She's staring at me so hard. Anyway, so bringing logic and reason to faith meant kind of discounting the traditional church authority, saying, I don't need to go to church and have some priest or minister, tell me what is right and wrong. I need to observe nature, and that is where I can witness God. And so there's some new faiths that come out of the Enlightenment that kind of see religion in this new way. Among these, the most famous is deism. And you also had Arminianism. Let's talk about deism for just a second, because I find it really interesting. I like the notion of deism. It's the basic idea, the metaphor that God is the watchmaker. So like a watchmaker, he spends all this time making this very intricate watch, all these cogs and pieces, and they have to fit together, just perfectly. And then once he winds that up, it just starts ticking, and he's made this beautiful, very intricate creation, but then he just lets it tick on, he lets it run. And that's the metaphor in deism, that God is the watchmaker, that he made the universe, but then allows us to just carry on without his intervention. So in a sense, what deism gives is free will. That we don't have God interfering or deciding to smite us or lift us up. We get to have the freedom of choice and will to decide what we want to make of our lives, for good and for evil. And that gives a lot of freedom either way there. So deism is the most famous and popular of the Enlightenment religions. And I also want to mention it because several of America's founding fathers, most important men who created our country, were actually deists. Like, as before mentioned, Benjamin Franklin was a deist. He was from the Quaker, colony of Pennsylvania. but he became a deist, and that really influenced a lot of his writings and his beliefs. You also had Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, and the author of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. He actually was such a deist that he took his Bible and he ripped out the pages to where there was only about 40 something pages left of his Bible, because he took out all the miracles and all the other things that couldn't be explained through logic and reason, and boiled it down to basically just the teachings of Jesus Christ, and said this is his Bible. That, he believes in God. God is the watchmaker. He believes that Jesus was a person, a historical, influential person, and that these are ideas that are valuable and worth having. But he rejected all, authority of any recognized, organized church to tell him what he should believe and how he should act. That this was going to be his teachings. So that's called the Jeffersonian Bible, shortened version. So he was definitely a deist. And of course, his disciple, James Madison, the fourth president of the United States, little short guy, just 5'2", he was also a deist. He followed Jefferson's way. One of the other most important deists you should know about, I mean, obviously many of the Enlightenment philosophers themselves, such as Locke and Voltaire, the French philosopher, they were deist as well. But another of the founding fathers that will write on his deism, and actually ruined his life, because many people were so upset that he would espouse these radical notions of the time, was Thomas Paine, the man who wrote Common Sense and really helped get the American Revolution going. He was a very noted deist. Anyway, so the Enlightenment, there's a lot of pieces to it, but we're putting logic and reason as basically the mantle for what people should follow instead of organized church and state. And among these philosophers, you should know about John Locke, because he's going to be the most important to be threaded into our American values and our government directly. John Locke, his two treatises on government gets almost plagiarized. They didn't really have like plagiarism back in the day, copyright stuff. It was kind of like a lot of these philosophers, it's like rock stars. They borrow from each other and then they get their music better and better. Like how I guess the Rolling Stone like kind of begets the Who, and they're all kind of from the Beatles, and they all kind of borrow from. Y'all don't know any of the references I'm saying, do you? She's still on my lap, by the way. This cat will not leave me alone. But yeah, these different philosophers, they borrow from one another. It wasn't seen as copyright infringement or anything. But yeah, John Locke, he actually writes in his two treatises that all people are born with inherent rights, what we would know today through the Declaration of Independence as unalienable rights, God-given rights that no government, no authority could ever take from you. So essentially all people are born equal because we all have these rights, even though these philosophers, when they refer to equality, they're only meaning propertied white men of a certain age. But by saying these things, they open the door to other groups like the poor and women and even eventually slaves. It's a beginning. So John Locke says all people are entitled to life, liberty, and property. And Thomas Jefferson will directly borrow that when he writes the Declaration of Independence and just change that in part thanks to the urgings of his editors, John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But Locke goes on to describe some other very important things that set up our government eventually. Remember, John Locke is writing this at like the end of the 1600s. And in fact, in his lifetime, his work wasn't even that popular, but the Enlightenment will spread from Europe, from Britain, where Locke was from, over across the Atlantic to North America. And these ideas will become incredibly important for what we do. But he goes on to say that governments exist through the will of the people, and that if any government becomes destructive to these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it, to end that government, to have a revolution, right? And to establish a new government that will protect the people's rights. And so that's all directly in like the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. You also have the French philosophers, Jean Rousseau, you have Montesquieu, With Rousseau and the earlier English writer Thomas Hobbes, you get the social contract theory that says we need government, but government exists by the collective will of the people. And you can see that kind of a little bit with Locke, the will of the people. The first three words to our Constitution, you can see this, are we the people, right? The United States, in order to form a more perfect union. But basically, the social contract theory from Hobbes and Rousseau says that we need a government to take care of our basic necessities and to protect our rights. And that in order for us to have this government, we have to give up a little bit of our freedom in order to have this thing that will protect us. But we're all agreeing to do this, and we're all kind of looking out for each other as a collective will. Now, of course, later on in like the 19th century, these ideas will go even further, more radical, with notions from guys like German philosopher Karl Marx. What philosophy / government economic theory am I talking about, Karl Marx? I bet some of you know. It's communism, baby. That's right. But those ideas come about later. This is the beginning of these notions. And what they're doing is upending society. Remember, society has always functioned by the rule of like one strong leader. These Enlightenment philosophers, they're actually talking about, a government that's of the people, by the people, for the people. Oh, speaking of which, another noted deist, probably Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, he had to kind of quiet up on some of his beliefs when he almost lost one of his early congressional races, but a lot of historians think that Lincoln might have been a deist as well. Check it out. Who knows? But yeah, government of the people, by the people, for the people. That is the essence of what we're talking about, that we don't have a king or queen or monarch in charge. Those can become despotic. Those can become like dictators, basically, rule of despotism. Instead, we have a Republican form of government. And no, I do not mean the political parties, Democrats and Republicans. That comes about much, much later. Lincoln, first Republican president, actually. No, we're talking about republic, like the Roman Republic, which is what so many of these Enlightenment philosophers go back to, and what the founding fathers really, really esteemed. They really loved the Roman Republic. That's why when they were writing, the Federalist Papers and other important documents for our government under pseudonyms, they borrowed from famous Roman senators of the Republic that had existed, thousands years before. So the Roman Republic, a republican form of government, that is a government where the people elect those who rule over them. Okay, and that's an idea that's really coming to fruition here in the Enlightenment. That is a type of government that is more just. Now, there's also the idea of virtue. That you don't necessarily have to have an evil dictatorship if you have a monarchy. It should be based on virtue. But that's not the same as like moral virtue that we have today. Virtue being the sense that we look out for each other and we feel a need to help one another out. A good, virtuous monarch would feel a need to be benevolent to his or her citizens. You should also know, so make sure you know John Locke. He's the most important of the Enlightenment philosophers, English philosopher. Remember consent of the governed, remember unalienable or natural rights. We'll talk more about that when we get to the Declaration of Independence. But the other probably most important philosopher you should know about, and I don't think we'll have like Voltaire or Rousseau or Hobbes on the test, but you should know about Montesquieu, because Montesquieu, writing again in like the 17th century, 1600s, he is kind of the creator of the notion of separation of powers. And Locke agrees with this as well. Most of them agree with this, but he really kind of formulates the idea that there should be checks and balances and a separation of powers, because if any one branch of government becomes too powerful, then that can lead to tyranny, that can lead to despotism, that can lead to a dictatorship, in other words. Power needs to be spread out, that you should never have those with the power to make the laws also with the power to execute those laws, have those two things separate, which creates, like when we make our constitution and when we create our government, that creates for you a legislative branch, Congress, that's in charge of making the laws, and then an executive branch, president and all his dudes and cabinet and vice president. They're in charge of executing or enforcing the laws. And then we split it into yet another branch of power, the judicial branch, that's in charge of overseeing those laws and making sure that they are just, interpreting the law. So Montesquieu gives us separation of powers, system of checks and balances to keep the branches of power in check. That's why it's called that. A lot of things we'll talk about later, but this is going around in the 1700s. A lot of the founding fathers, they're going to be big readers and disciples of the Enlightenment. So make sure you know the impact of the Enlightenment as we move forward going up to the American Revolution. The other big social change undercurrent that is taking hold of the colonies in the 1700s is the Great Awakening. And this is going to see a lot of people get a whole lot more Jesus in their lives in the early to mid 1700s. Now, reasons for this is a decline in church membership in the late 1600s. Because of the Enlightenment, a lot of people were like, I don't really need to go to church. I can go and observe nature and be close to what I see as God, or I can not believe in God. You know, I'm going to be dictated by logic and reason. And so there was a decline in church membership. That's just one reason why there's decline. Probably the biggest reason for the decline was the rise in mercantilism and trade and commerce. People became more busy making more money and getting more property and attending church a little bit less. Values were shifting. Now, obviously, this decline in church membership led to a lot of ministers becoming very worried about the future of their churches that they had just built. Remember, churches in the American colonies were very new compared to churches over in Europe. Some of the churches over there, go back 1,000 years or even older. Churches over here in the colonies were literally built, just when did the colonists come over? Like 1619 was for slaves. 1607 was Jamestown, right? So I mean, these churches were like less than 100 years old, and their future was at stake. So ministers needed to find a way to revitalize people, get people energized and excited about the church again. And one of the ways that they tried to increase the numbers in church was through the halfway covenant. This was done in New England. And yes, I know when we talk about New England, you're like, oh, that's Massachusetts. Yes, yes, it is Massachusetts. There were some other colonies besides Massachusetts in New England, though. It's also like Rhode Island, Connecticut, mostly Massachusetts. The halfway covenant was for these sons and grandsons of church members who weren't really feeling the religious vibes. It said that they could become members of the church without receiving communion. So it was like, a partial membership in the church just to try to grab them up and keep them from going their ways. Another thing to consider here is how intrinsic, how entrenched the church and the ministers, who led these churches. She's still in my lap. She's purring. She's so sweet. Want to say hi? If you're gonna be here, there you go. These church ministers and the churches themselves, they were paid for by the members of the community. There is no separation of church and state at this point. And in fact, it's the very opposite. And so a lot of people kind of were upset and being like, well, why does some of my money have to go to this church that I don't even attend? Once you start to pay for something, you feel a sense of ownership for it. And so increasingly ministers felt pressure to try to make their sermons a little bit more engaging, a little bit more exciting, because, people were like, I'm not buying it. This is my money. You better give me something worthwhile there. So keep in mind that aspect, the money as well. Now, in our class, there's lots of ministers of the Great Awakening, and we're going to talk about an even more impactful movement in the next century, the Second Great Awakening. But with the First Great Awakening in the early mid 1700s, there's really two traveling ministers you need to know about. The first one is Mr. Jonathan Edwards, and the second one is George Whitefield. Now, Jonathan Edwards was from New England. He is like a Puritan minister, and his style was to speak really softly and to get his audience kind of drawn in. See, she's listening very carefully, and he would increase his rate, but he never spoke that loudly, but people would just hang on his every word. His most famous sermon was called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where he basically describes God as this vengeful being who holds humanity on a little spindly thread over an eternal flame, like a little insect, and that's all we are to God. The only thing that can save us, the only salvation that exists, is to have belief in Jesus, basically. That's called grace. That through grace you can find salvation. Salvation is to be saved, to end up in heaven when you die. Otherwise, you end up in the HE double hockey sticks realm. You don't want to end up there. So it's a very emotive sermon that he really drew in the crowds for. And there would be thousands of people that would come to hear Jonathan Edwards speak. He was incredibly, incredibly influential. And what he did was he made his sermons, popular entertainment. He became a celebrity. Obviously, celebrityhood has changed in the few hundred years between the 1700s and 2020. Now our celebrities are like, the Kardashians and whatnot. The early American celebrity was a traveling minister, an itinerant pastor. But they would have huge crowds, and people would cry. People would hold themselves in their heart because they were just so overcome with emotion. Talking about your life, heaven and hell, your ability to save yourself through having this individual connection to God and Jesus. These were the things that were talked about, and basically it rejects the old notion of church. In the older notion of church, there was other things that would save you. The elect versus the damned and stuff we've talked about. This is much more highly individualized. Now, Jonathan Edwards, he is going to die early, I think in the 1750s, but his grandson will actually later on become the third vice president of the United States. And will actually end up murdering the first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. Anybody know who I'm talking about? Aaron Burr, sir? That's right. Aaron Burr is Jonathan Edwards' grandson. And yeah, he does kill famously in 1804. He kills Alexander Hamilton, our nation's first Treasury Secretary, in a duel in New Jersey. And then flees out west and tries to establish his own country called Fredonia, and just a big mess. But he was a vice president of the United States, Aaron Burr. The other famous, you need to know him, Great Awakening, first Great Awakening minister is George Whitefield. He was from England, migrated over to the United States, and in Georgia set up one of the first famous public orphanages. And he started his itinerant, that means traveling ministership, where he'd go around from city to city giving his sermons in order to raise funds for this orphanage, Bethesda Orphanage in Georgia. And he's not as intellectual as Edwards. Doesn't have any famous catchphrase sermon like Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. But George Whitefield had a charismatic personality, and it did not match with his face. Like this guy, I don't mean to speak ill of the dead, but he was not a looker. His face was kind of blotchy and bloated, and he had these cross-eyed, vision going on. It was not a sight to behold, but his voice was huge and just booming. Benjamin Franklin once said that he was up at the stage with George Whitefield, and he started walking away from him to gauge how far away he could hear this man speak. And he got 500 feet away and could still hear him like clear as a bell. So, this guy had a big voice. And George Whitefield, he even managed to get Benjamin Franklin, a deist, to give donations for his orphanage, and drew crowds like 10 to 20,000 people everywhere he went. Now, Jonathan Edwards, he was doing this primarily in New England. George Whitefield went across the colonies. And so something to consider here is that this is kind of the first time that you have a movement, something in common, uniting different colonies at the same time, a unifying effect, because this wasn't just happening in Georgia or in South Carolina or in Massachusetts. This was happening across the colonies and even in the western frontier regions. These traveling ministers would come around and they would overthrow kind of the established community, that the community was based on the old church and everybody kind of had to pay into it and all that. No longer. Now there's serious tensions that develop in society over this. As you can imagine, people don't like change to happen. People don't like their way of life being uprooted, as everybody starts to say, yeah, I don't need that old church anymore. Why do we have to pay this tax to the church? Why can't we have our own faith? Why don't we set up a new church? And so this division, you start to see the old lights, who are the traditionalists, the ones who espouse like the old church membership and everything. We're pushing for the halfway covenant, versus the new lights. You are falling down so hard. What are you doing? Yeah, and the new lights, these are the ones that are starting to follow these new itinerant pastors and ministers and reverends. I don't want to go into the difference between a minister, a pastor, and a reverend, but you can look it up if you want. But yeah, the new lights versus the old lights. And as we get closer to the American Revolution, what does all this mean? Well, think about it. If you can reject the highest authority that mankind had at this time, that you can reject the authority of the church, then it's very easy to reject like the authority of the government, of the king, especially when that king is so far away and your church was right there in your very own community. So this is a questioning of authority that this breeds. Some of the different groups that are going to come about, and really like Methodist denomination started in England, that had existed a little bit before this, but it's going to gain in membership. Methodism and Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, and many others, those churches will begin to sprout up all throughout the colonies and gain a whole lot of influence. This is really the beginning of evangelical Christianity. And in fact, many of these ministers that went around from city to city giving these sermons that drew in large crowds outdoors, they were called evangelicals, like literally spreading the good word. Now, evangelical Christianity is one of the major religions in America today. And it's incredibly important. Evangelicals make up a sizable political group as well. And their beliefs, their fundamentalism, their traditionalism, that has had a resounding impact on American politics to this day, which we will definitely talk more about. We'll talk more about as we get into the next century and the Second Great Awakening as well. But the big takeaway you should have from this lecture about the First Great Awakening is that it breeds a questioning of authority, okay? And it's going along as you have, at the same time, other ideas traveling across the Atlantic as well, ideas such as Enlightenment philosophies. Yeah, and I should have, as I was summarizing this, I should have had this in front of you, but there you go. The revivals, that's these sermons, the itinerant pastors going around the colonies. They spread. Old churches splitting. This is the new lights versus the old lights. Old lights are the old churches. New lights are these new Christian churches like Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, and so on. And the general idea, like these sermons are all different from all these different ministers. And there's many more besides just Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. But the general idea that most of them were preaching on was that you can achieve salvation through grace alone, that no longer is there the idea of the elect versus the saved, that you're born, you're predestined to go to one place or the other, that you have the choice. And having that choice, that's kind of from the Enlightenment as well, right? It gives you that sense of free will, that you are in charge of your own destiny, that you can make of yourself what you want. This is a much more popular message. Populist, popular being like of the people. And this doesn't just apply to like rich first white sons. This could be second and third sons. That was a huge block of the membership of the First Great Awakening. It also applies to women who are very marginalized during this time. They saw empowerment through this message, and even slaves as well. Many of the African slaves, especially like in the Chesapeake area, they're going to come into the Christian fold during this First Great Awakening. And although the revivalist aim was this spiritual, saving through grace, the independent frame of mind that the revivals encouraged, it's going to have a significant impact leading us into the American Revolution. All right. We will get into the French and Indian War in the next lecture. Thank you guys for your attention. I will talk to you later. Bye.